first of 4 panels. This one's titled Vancouver 2020, The Road to 100% Renewable. Our panelists will discuss the vision behind Vancouver's Green City Action Plan, where we are now and where we want to be. First, I'd like to call up Chris Higgins. Chris is a green building planner with the City of Vancouver and is the moderator for this panel. Chris is an accomplished project manager who has developed a number of successful programs that overcome market barriers and results in low energy buildings. He possesses a well-developed knowledge of energy use in residential buildings and has experience to know the policy triggers to encourage action. As a green building planner at the City of Vancouver, Chris develops and implements policy and programs to achieve 100% renewable new buildings while at the same time helping to reduce greenhouse gases from existing buildings. He works to remove barriers in policy from passive house projects and possesses an understanding of regulatory and incentive options a city has at its disposal. Chris is a spokesperson at a national conference and at various media outlets. Next, I'd like to introduce Thomas Mueller. He's a founding director of the Canada Green Building Council and became president and CEO of the council in 2005. As chief executive, he leads the council's national green building strategy, programs, and standards along with the advocacy and policy initiatives. As a member of the board of directors of Green Business Certification Institute and the Cornerstone Standards Council, and as an immediate past board member of the World Green Building Council, he supports the transition towards green buildings, neighborhoods, and cities at home and globally. Thomas is a well-known advocate for green buildings and sustainable community development. He participates frequently in government and industry consultations on green developments and is nationally and internationally recognized authority and speaker on green buildings. Next, I'd like to invite Bill MacKinnon. He's the manager of energy management, development, and asset strategies for BC Housing. Bill has been promoting energy efficient and sustainable design in social housing, business, and communities for many years. He is a manager of the energy management team at BC Housing, a lead associate professional in building design and construction, and a certified energy manager. He holds a degree in environmental and conservation sciences from the University of Alberta. Bill specializes in identifying energy savings potentials in new buildings and renovation projects. He is currently working to incorporate the Provincial Energy Step Code into BC Housing's design guidelines and construction standards. And finally, last but not least, Mr. Mark Russell of PACS. Mark's the current PACS secretary and the past president of the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors. Mark has also held positions provincially as the chair of the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors, British Columbia. He is also a past chair of the Public Construction Council of British Columbia, a multi-stakeholder organization consisting of construction industry groups, government ministries, agencies, and crown corporations operating within the province of British Columbia. Mark is a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Quantity Surveyors and is also a Award of Merit recipient in recognition of his outstanding service in the CIQS and making it the fine organization that it is today. He is a UK-educated and trained quantity surveyor with over 25 years' experience. Mark immigrated to Vancouver in 2000 and initially worked on a variety of educational and healthcare facilities for a number of First Nations communities across all areas of British Columbia. Since 2006, Mark has been a partner at LEC Group, a full-service private practice quantity surveying firm based in downtown Vancouver. Mark's specific experience is focused on construction of casino resorts, hotels, healthcare facilities, new schools, and seismic upgrades on existing buildings. Let's give a round of applause for the whole panel. I'll now turn the floor over to Chris.
Great, thank you, Matt. Just make sure I've only got one mic on. Great. So I noticed we have many international delegates here today. I hope you have a chance to explore Vancouver a little bit while you're here. I first came to Vancouver as a stopover on my way to China in 1988 and had a chance to explore Stanley Park. So I hope you have a little bit of time off from the conference to take a little bit of a walk there. We've got a really stellar panel this morning, and I'm really excited to be part of it. And I'm pleased to start us off with a little presentation about the City of Vancouver's efforts. So the Greenest City Action Plan. The City of Vancouver has a Greenest City Action Plan which has a variety of goals. I'm not going to go through all of the goals today, but I will focus on buildings. But before I start, I thought I would give a little bit of background. I'm a green building planner with the City of Vancouver, but I've worked in the construction, development or green building industry for the last almost 15 years. And for a number of those years, I developed retail and warehouse space and worked with a number of quantity surveyors. And it became really clear to me that quantity surveyors, both as individuals, as firms, and as an industry, are very much the unsung heroes. Your work doesn't often show up on the cover of magazines, but you're absolutely essential to ensuring projects are delivered on time and on budget. And when considering new standards, like the ones I'm about to talk about, it's the number one question that we get as a city is, how much is this going to cost? How can it factor into a project? Is it feasible? So certainly you'll be an incredible partner. And I think there's a tremendous business opportunity in moving towards healthier, more energy efficient, better ventilated buildings. So as I mentioned, there's a number of parts of the strategy. The three high-level objectives is zero carbon, zero waste, and healthy ecosystems. But today I'll just be focusing on the zero carbon portion and green buildings in particular. The City of Vancouver has a goal by 2030 to achieve 100% renewable. So 100% renewable energy used in new buildings. So all buildings will only use renewable energy. There's a number of buildings that are under construction today in Vancouver that are going to run on 100% renewable energy. And 100% renewable by 2050 for all transportation and for existing buildings. So it's a significant step, but it is a doable step. There are a few buildings under renovation currently that will achieve 100% renewable as well. But how do we get there? How do we get to 100% renewable? Well, one of the first steps is to reduce energy use significantly, and one strategy is Passive House. So if you haven't heard of Passive House, it's an approach to reducing energy use 60 to 90% for space heating and cooling. And the process is through super insulation, so you add additional insulation to the building. You greatly improve air tightness. You add heat recovery ventilator at a very high level of recovery, 90 to 92% recovery, and you have triple glazed windows. All of these pieces cost more. There's a higher capital cost, and that's where your industry can really assist us in delivering these buildings. This is an example on the slide of a single family house, but there's a variety of buildings that are being built to the Passive House standard. One of the key components that changes, the cost changes significantly, is windows. In Vancouver and Greater Vancouver, we now have 2 local window manufacturers. This is one, Cascadia Windows, but there's also another Euroline. The costs for Passive House certified windows, which are not only triple glazed, but they also have insulation throughout the frame, and the frame itself is designed to minimize thermal bridging. The cost of the windows and doors is significantly different, and it's one of the key things projects are trying to understand as they move towards the Passive House standard. There's a variety of building types. This is a high-rise in New York City that's under construction. They're just working on the interior finishings. This is a rendering of it. It's a Passive House high-rise, and it's on a university campus. A little closer to home, a few blocks east from here, we've got a 6-story Passive House project. It's 5 stories of residential over 1 story of commercial, and it's in our Chinatown. Also, the City of Vancouver is demonstrating leadership. We've got a Passive House fire hall number 17, which is also in the zero carbon pilot that Thomas is going to talk about shortly. And we're moving towards Passive House certification with that project as well, so sort of a dual certification. And one of the really key pieces early on with our facilities and our real estate team, and I'm sure Bill will talk a little bit about this process, but was understanding what the capital costs were and working with a quantity surveyor there, and then also understanding what the operating cost savings are and trying to balance, create a balance, because there are higher upfront costs. So speaking of costs, we can go into just a tiny bit of detail. I try to avoid numbers on slides, but I figured this group would be okay with it. Below-grade walls, so if we're looking at code minimum cost on a project in Vancouver, $35.93. The passive house cost was $37.25, so incremental cost per square foot was $1.32, 4% increase. Much higher increase on above-grade walls, actually up 23%, so quite significant. Windows, a 15% premium, roof, 17% premium, and mechanical costs. There's actually a savings in mechanical costs, and I think Mark will touch a little bit on the savings in mechanical versus higher capital costs on envelopes. But there's some significant savings there, and so one of the questions that remains unanswered is how much does air tightness cost? Because that's not something you can purchase off the shelf. It's a combination of materials, labor, training, and execution. And then finding out what the total cost was. And so in this case, it was $59 a square foot was the code cost and $66 per square foot for the passive house, so an increase of $7 a square foot for this specific project. So there really is a huge and expanding role for the quantity survey industry with passive house and moving towards net zero. And that's because the building is actually, there's physically more of it. So you need to understand the increased cost of more insulation, better windows, as well as improved or reduced mechanicals. So that's great. That's what Vancouver's doing. We're moving towards 100% renewable. 100% renewable in all new buildings by 2030, existing buildings by 2050, and transportation by 2050. But I recognize there's a lot of international delegates here, and perhaps you don't do business in Vancouver. Well, 100% renewable is actually being pursued by a large number of cities. I pulled this list. It's not complete. It goes far off the bottom of the slide. But certainly Germany, the United States, Denmark, Japan, Italy, Australia, the Caribbean, Korea, Uganda, Austria. There's cities in all of these countries that are pursuing the 100% renewable standard. And year after year, there's more and more cities going for 100% renewable. So I would certainly encourage the group to get prepared for this next generation of buildings. And so what can you do to get prepared? Where do you go from here? So you sort of understand there is a transition underway and buildings are changing, and the number one question that comes up is how much are these new buildings going to cost, and can we afford to build them? I would certainly encourage you to take some training. If you're within Canada, you could go to passivehousecanada.com. You can also Google Passive House plus your local jurisdiction, or you can also Google your local Green Building Council, whether it's the Canada Green Building Council or the US Green Building Council or another World Green Building Council. You could Google them to look for training to understand these next generation of buildings. And you can also read the plans that the jurisdictions you're working in, so in this case the City of Vancouver, have. So we have a near zero emissions new building plan, and go through it and see, well, what is the city, what is the country, what is the province planning for in terms of the next generation of buildings. And by doing that, you'll help prepare your firm and yourself for a future where we have buildings that use less energy, use improved materials, and have better health outcomes. There's an opportunity here, and I know when we as a city are looking to work with QS firms, we've had a challenge to date finding QS firms that are very familiar with Passive House. So we often partner with an engineering firm. The engineering firm actually does the majority of the work, and the QS firm reviews their work at the end. I think there is a real opportunity here for QS firms that understand Passive House to be able to take on a much larger or much increased scope of work and actually take on more of the business themselves. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Thomas.
Good morning. And thank you, Chris, for a really great introduction. I'm Thomas Mueller. I'm with the Canada Green Building Council. And let's see if we here on we go. So I wanted to talk this morning a little bit bigger picture about Canada and how we're moving in Canada to the low-carbon building sector. And the policy document in Canada is really called the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. It was issued by our federal government last year, our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and it really lays out how clean growth, the economy, and climate change can really actually go hand in hand. to achieve very ambitious climate change goals in Canada, consistent with what's happening in the rest of the world. In Canada, we're really focusing on 4 things that we're trying to drive forward to get to the kind of low carbon building sector. 2 of those items I want to talk about this morning, which is really the first one, to invest in the energy efficiency in existing buildings. And I want to be very clear that we won't be able to reach our carbon goals in the building sector without focusing on existing buildings. I'm not talking about homes, I'm talking about larger existing buildings over 25,000 square feet. The building sector itself, and it depends on which country you're from, but on average 30 to 35% of carbon emissions come from the building sector. In Canada, it's in that range. In the city of Vancouver, it's 54% of carbon emissions come from buildings and from homes. So we need to focus both on the existing as well as on the new buildings to achieve our goals. The second strategy that you see that I want to talk about a little this morning is to invest in zero carbon buildings. And I emphasize carbon, and a simple reason is we talk a lot about energy efficiency in buildings, which is a very important concept, obviously. But really, we talk about energy efficiency and energy use when you really want to talk about carbon. Because the future is really about carbon reduction. And we need to look at how we deal with energy to achieve our carbon reduction goals. So we did a study for the federal government that last year. And the government asked us, I said, what would it take to get to a 30% reduction of carbon emissions from the building sector? So we looked at the existing building side, and we have about 240,000 buildings in Canada. So I mean, buildings, these are larger buildings, not homes. We have about 12 million homes in Canada, about 240,000, 250,000 buildings. And about 100,000 of those buildings are over 25,000 square feet, which is about 2,500, year quantity, so you know how to translate that. But anyway, and so we looked at the 100,000 buildings, and what it means is that 80% of those 100,000 buildings need to be recommissioned. Another 60% need to see deep retrofit. 40% need to be put on some kind of renewable energy source, that is a fossil-free source, and about 20% of those buildings will need to see fuel switching. If we did that by 2030, so over the next 14 years, we would see a 19.8 million ton reduction in carbon emissions from existing buildings, and it's actually above the 30%, would actually be 38%. So you can see from a model perspective, this is actually possible, and there are these opportunities. These are strategies that already exist. These are technologies that exist. This is know-how that already exists. So what we're really talking about with the federal government, and again, bringing together climate change and clean growth, is about the concept of the retrofit economy, which means is we actually retrofit buildings to lower energy and carbon performance, and at the same time, you are going to create jobs, a great demand for technology and for services to bring the existing building sector to a level of performance that's consistent with our national and global climate change goals. And these are just, I don't want to get into much detail, but these are really the 4 components you see on the left-hand side. You need good public policy. You need competitive firms that can provide services and products and technologies in the marketplace at a competitive price. You need standards of practices and what are we trying to achieve. And finally, you need information transparency. And in Canada and in British Columbia as well, we talk a lot about energy benchmarking and energy disclosure and reporting. Is a very important concept to really understand how much energy and water and those types of things buildings actually use. This data is not readily available in Canada on a national basis. And these things are necessary to really build consumer confidence. And I wanted to talk about that a bit more because it's so important. The impact of the retrofit economy by 2030 would be not only in terms of carbon emission, which you see in the top, but it would contribute $32.5 billion to GDP. We would save $6.2 billion in energy. Even at our low energy costs, if we executed the plan as we laid it out, we would save $6.2 billion in energy by 2030 every year. We would have 260,000 people employed, full-time employment in that sector, and the government would collect $5.2 billion in tax revenue. A very good value proposition. So why is it not happening? That's the question. Because we have so many buildings that are actually, it's economically viable to retrofit them, but it's not happening for one reason or another. And the three top reasons are financing, access to finance, performance uncertainty. Will the building perform after the retrofit the way it was intended to perform? And the third one is the transaction cost, because each retrofit is assessed on a case-by-case basis, which really increases the transaction costs. So one thing that we're currently piloting is called the Investor Confidence Project, which is a framework and a toolkit of energy efficiency underwriting standards. So basically providing a standard to the existing building sector on how retrofit projects should be assessed, how you reduce transaction costs, how you reduce investor risk, and how you achieve your energy efficiency goals. On the second part, and it's really important when we talk about new buildings. So we have to really be very cognizant and very driven to future-proof our new building stock to very low or zero carbon performance. So the council released its zero carbon standard in end of May at our conference here. It was also held in Vancouver. And the emphasis is on carbon, because I think we need to shift the conversation to carbon. This is what we're trying to reduce, and it depends on, okay, I'll give you a good example. It really depends where your building are and what the energy mix is in the province where your building is, or in your case, where your building is in the world. So the same building, when you build it in Quebec, who has a very clean energy, electricity source, and in Alberta, the same building would produce 10 times as much carbon emissions in Alberta than it would in Quebec. So you need to recognize that energy efficiency be a core concept, but you also have to look at your energy mix, because that depends to a great deal, just like Chris was talking about City of Vancouver. We have with BC Hydro here, hydro source, we have a very clean energy source that's 95% carbon free. Maybe it's 96, maybe it's 94, but very high level. So really what you have to really look at then, you have to replace the fossil fuels that you still use to heat, your building, and that's why energy efficiency and what Chris described is hugely important. But I want you to start thinking about carbon and how buildings are designed and valued with carbon, because in Canada, 5 years from now, you have to pay for your energy costs, and you also have a carbon bill, because carbon will be priced at $50 a ton by 2022. And this is just a definition how we look at zero carbon buildings. It's highly energy efficient. It needs to be to reduce then the amount that you need to of renewable energy you need to replace fossil fuels. And that can either be generated in our standard on-site, or we can get it through direct purchase off-site. But what we don't allow is, we don't allow to offset carbon. Because if everybody starts offsetting carbon, then somebody's got to do the work. And we intend with this standard to actually do the work. There are 4 components to it. So the building needs to be zero carbon over the course of a year. And we do recognize in Canada, with some areas being quite remote, whereas we have highly populated cities, densely populated cities, but we also have very remote and rural areas in Canada. And we do realize that some of these projects still need to use fossil fuels, but they need to offset that fossil fuel over the course of the year through renewable energy sources. Energy efficiency, number 2, highly important again, particularly around envelope, how we ventilate buildings, and envelope performance, the demand for thermal energy. Renewable energy, again, either generated on-site, or you can purchase it directly off-site. And finally, low carbon materials. And what we mean by low carbon materials, we're starting to want to demonstrate and bring transparency. What's the carbon content actually of the materials that we use in buildings? Because that's another 15, maybe 17% of a carbon footprint of a building are the materials that are being used. These are 15 pilot projects that we have across Canada right now that range from multi-unit residential buildings to commercial office buildings in downtown Toronto to the City of Vancouver Fire Hall that's also on our zero carbon pilot project. And I just want you to finish off is that And that's really the juxtaposition between existing buildings and new buildings. If we build all new buildings between now and 2030 to zero carbon, then we would save another 7.5 million tons. That's compared to the 19.8 million tons that we would get from retrofitting existing buildings. So if we built every new building over 25,000 square feet, we would get only 7.5 million tons. Obviously, it's needed to future-proof the sector, but just to make the point where we need to do both. And LEED, Canada has a very active and a very big green building market. It has the second largest market for LEED buildings in the world, ahead of China, India, more populous countries. So we have a very maturing market here in Canada that will really help us to step into this very effectively to move the agenda forward on carbon. But LEED and LEED version 4 that we have in Canada, we have currently about 1 billion square feet of LEED projects in Canada. We are also driving through LEED carbon reduction from whole building life cycle assessment to material environmental product declarations to community scale renewable energy projects and demand response. And even in this case, it's a global standard in 160 countries, but to also through carbon offsets. So I want to finish with that and just show you that really the policy and practice in the building industry in Canada are changing very rapidly. And we do see this replicated in the rest of the world. So Australia has a very active zero carbon program, as do other countries like India, Sweden, Germany, and the US. So this is not something that's just unique to Canada. This is really a massive change that is happening in how we look at buildings, how we design buildings, and the part that we need to get underway in how to retrofit buildings. And that's really where you also can play a very important role. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you for your time this morning, and I'll hand it over to Bill.
So I'm Bill MacKinnon, manager of the energy management team at BC Housing. I just wanted to speak with you for just a couple of minutes about how I got into sustainability in the first place. One of the inspiring figures for me in my life was David Suzuki, who you're going to hear speak afterwards, so you're in for a great treat. When I was visiting BC for the first time, I'm originally from Alberta, in 1989, I saw my first clear-cut logging, and it really felt wrong with for me. I really felt that that wasn't sustainable. Very soon after that, I saw David Suzuki's Nature of Things special, Amazonia, The Road to the End of the Forest, right after seeing that clear-cut. So it really gave me some things that I could do to put into action the feelings that I felt about unsustainable practices. So for me, moving through my career, I took a conservation and environmental sciences degree. I worked in parks, but in working in parks, I saw a lot of the impacts, a lot of the environmental impacts that were harming parks were coming from upstream sources. So that really got me curious about energy efficiency and working on green buildings, which I've been doing for about the last 15 years. So one of the things I've learned on design teams for buildings is that buildings are very complex, and that it amazes me we get the buildings done and they operate at the end of the day, given all the decisions that need to be made. And quantity surveyors play a huge role in making that happen. They really, we're the government crown agency responsible for social and affordable housing in BC, and it's really important that we maximize the number of affordable housing units while also making those buildings sustainable. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why we're on the path to net zero ready buildings, our standards, the benefits to our organization and to the industry, and also some of our first projects and lessons learned. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the costing lessons we've learned as well. Our current situation, BC Housing is a leader in sustainability in British Columbia. We have achieved a 31% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions from our 2005 baseline on our renovated buildings. And then also on the new construction side, we have over 60 projects registered with the Canada Green Building Council of which 40 are LEED Gold certified. So we're really advancing on the new construction side, and we've done lots on the renovation side as well. One thing we've learned as we've been building more and more efficient buildings is that as we get more and more efficient with the buildings, the systems are tending to become more and more complex and expensive. So we've done third-party reviews on a lot of these buildings, like this building that achieved over 80% reduction in GHG emissions in downtown Vancouver. It has a geothermal heating system, so it's a little more complex. So one of the things we're learning through third-party reviews is that the buildings are much more difficult to operate. These, around the same time that we were discovering this, I was invited by the City of Vancouver to the International Passive House Conference, where I learned about buildings that were 80–90% more efficient in terms of heating energy. These are some of the projects that I learned about at the conference and that you'll have an opportunity to learn about during the week. The top one of your members, Simon Amesbury, was very involved in. That is the first multifamily passive house in BC. The second one is the Salis Clementine project in Ontario, the first large multifamily passive house project in Canada, and the one on the right is the Heights project, which you'll also have an opportunity to learn about during the Pechakucha. So I won't talk in a lot of detail about these projects, brilliant projects. So we are working on several passive house pilot projects ourselves as BC Housing, but one of the things we really need to do, we have a pillar that, one of our corporate pillars is sustainability, but one of our other corporate pillars is also to maximize the number of units of social housing. So we really needed to achieve both of those pillars at the same time. So around that same time, we were approached by the Building Safety and Standards branch from the province of British Columbia to develop their provincial energy step code. So this step code is a series of steps, really energy efficiency targets beyond building code. So the concept with this is to set a series of steps beyond building code that lead to net zero ready homes, and starting in 2017 with the existing building code to move all buildings towards net zero ready by 2032. We've aligned our BC Housing design guidelines and construction standards with the Provincial Energy Step Code. We require the highest levels of the Provincial Energy Step Code which is near net zero, not completely net zero as the theme of this presentation, but we're getting there. We also found that we needed to, as we were revamping our design guidelines and construction standards, we really had to focus on other sustainability issues such as water savings, waste, a lot of the great things that we achieved in our LEED projects, and not just on energy. So we've tried to be very holistic there. Benefits to our organization, as I mentioned, simpler mechanical systems is the number1 benefit. Often our buildings are run by nonprofits and possibly even a janitor, not someone that's mechanically inclined in a lot of cases. Another really big selling point for us was alignment with the Climate Leadership Plan. The province committed to supporting the step code, the energy step code, and also supporting passive house in the Climate Leadership Plan. So that was a great selling feature for us. City of Vancouver rezoning bylaw for new construction. Most of our projects being social housing where we can try to increase the density are required to go through rezoning. So we align very well with the City of Vancouver's rezoning bylaw. We're hoping we'll also align well with future municipal rezoning bylaws, which will be required to reference the Provincial Energy Step Code. Both utilities and government have alluded to the fact that they will be providing incentives for reaching the higher or the upper levels of the step code. And of course, as I mentioned, sustainability in residential construction is one of our corporate pillars. So that's something that really resonates with us. Benefits to the industry. Focus on the higher steps allows us to test out technologies and take some of those risks before the industry in general has to take them, before other builders have to take them. We've been instrumental in introducing things like better quality windows, higher efficiency, heat recovery ventilation systems like Chris was talking about, and as we continue to drive that will increase their uptake in the industry and hopefully reduce their costs. we're also doing a costing study along with the province to see what the costs of the additional measures that you need to reach Passive House and to reach the upper levels of the Provincial Energy Step Code will be. We've been working with the Passive House Institute US and international, along with borrowing some of the costing from the City of Vancouver to see, to really show that the costs are there, they're not exorbitant. And that's somewhere where quantity surveyors have really provided important input into this work. And frankly, the building industry has asked the government to lead. If you're going to ask us to get to net zero housing by 2032, we want you to take those risks and be the leaders. We have multiple Passive House projects that meet the upper levels of the STEP code or are being designed to meet those already. And we have multiple Passive House pilot projects across the province. This is just a rendering of one of our Passive House pilot projects in Smithers, BC, and northern BC. So one of the first multifamily projects in a northern climate. I wanted to show you this graph very briefly. I'm going to try with the laser pointer here. So fairly simple graph. It looks a little complex, but essentially along the bottom axis we see space heating demand, and along the left axis you're seeing capitalized costs. So as you build buildings more and more efficient along that axis, of course it's logical that you're going to see construction costs increase. Of course, as you build buildings more efficiently, you can see annual energy costs going down. That makes sense. The total project cost, the total cost of the project goes down to this kind of sweet spot in the middle. This is where we've always been aiming for in the past, is this cross between these two lines. And that's around step 3, and it's not quite near net zero ready. But if you continue that process and build more and more efficient envelopes, more and more airtight buildings with high efficiency heat recovery, eventually you reach a point which Chris alluded to, where you no longer need mechanical systems, or at least complex mechanical systems. You can get away with simpler systems like electric baseboards. So your costs drop. So this graph, as you can see, is in euros. So this information is from Germany. It's based on the Passive House International standard. So what we're doing with quantity surveyors here in the province that we're working with is trying to find out where our projects fall in this graph and where this little notch occurs in BC. So lots of different costing exercises going on across the province. One thing, as I mentioned, we can put downward pressure on this construction cost line by using innovative technologies and making them more affordable for industry. The province can put upward pressure on annual energy costs through the carbon tax, through mechanisms like the carbon tax and other policies. So essentially, most building code buildings are off this graph to the right. The province is really trying to get all buildings starting on the road on this graph. Most of our projects sit somewhere in the middle, and we're really working towards getting towards the passive end of this graph with all of our projects in the future. So that's our strategy to reach near net zero for BC housing. Thank you.
Good morning. Mark Russell. Most of you know me. I was looking about the room and I was thinking, all of these people will be fed up listening to me because you were listening to me yesterday shouting at you. I'm going to do a quick presentation on some cost aspects of Passive House, if I can figure out how to work the system. We've got some limited information on Passive House projects because they really are still in their infancy. So we don't have a great deal of projects that have been completed. As you can see from the presentation that Bill made, some of them are under construction right now, so we don't have final end numbers. The initial findings that were shown here are the capital expenditure premium is anywhere between 3 to 10% over the cost of a standard LEED project. And if you remember, sort of back in the early 2000s when LEED first came into the marketplace, everyone was looking at the sort of same numbers. They were looking at 3 to 10% of a variance. And right now, LEED is pretty much ubiquitous. It's now the standard. So just looking at some cost factors, the guys actually touched on some of these. Structure, envelope, drywall, building services, and general requirements. General requirements are, I guess, it's a Canadian terminology, but this is basically like preliminaries for your site, site trailers, site supervision, site management, just for the overseas guests. Some cost factors. So structure, we've got some cold bridge attenuation at balconies. So if you notice in downtown Vancouver, there's a lot of balconies, and these become kind of problematic because to alter them to passive house requirements is going to add quite a significant cost. I'm just throwing some numbers here. A significant cost increase as a result of the new passive house requirements. The envelope windows. We talked about windows earlier on. Again, they're super insulated. Triple glazing, and you have a little bit of a difference in the passive house in that they're trying to reduce the quantity of glazing in the envelope, which increases the cladding. So more integration with other envelope trades results in increased time on site. So it's not just as quick as the current process. And the roof obviously has increased insulation requirements. The drywall is actually partitions and not just drywall, because if we have increased insulation in stud cavities, then obviously we have thicker studs. And this can impact on things like the gross sale area, because as Chris mentioned, we actually end up increasing the building size, which obviously increase the overall project cost. And then air tightness, as again Chris mentioned earlier on, there's no real way to analyse what the cost is for air tightness. An example of that one is, for example, at light switches, that's a big issue for air tightness, and you end up having trades going back and spending time trying to get the building more airtight. The building systems and mechanical systems have got a significant cost reduction. Basically because you don't need as much heating and cooling for these new passive house. And then obviously electrical, they're moving away from air-conditioned buildings to a lighter baseboard heat. So general requirements or prelims or site conditions. So one of the factors that we have here is obviously we have, in its infancy, we have additional site supervision costs and monitoring and inspections. There's obviously more testing during construction, and there's a certification process that has to take place. So we're kind of hoping that as the trade efficiency increases, that we start to see a reduction in the actual costs for the general requirements as contractors and trades and suppliers get used to having this as being more normal than sort of lead. So what we got, this is some numbers. This is, believe it or not, a school and daycare study that we carried out for one of the school districts in Metro Vancouver. So we actually looked at, there's actually 8 options here that the school district were looking for, and this is option 2 and option 2A. They looked at various options for wood frame passive house, 3-story, 2-story, 2-story by daycare, 3-story by daycare, and this one here is probably the most relevant. So it's a comparison between, it's a concrete frame building for a 3-story school and daycare, and then using standard construction, and a 3-story school and daycare using passive house. So I'm going to try and use the pointer, see if this works. So as you can see here, we've got additional substructure costs, as alluded to by Chris. A little bit of an increase there. Same goes for structure, and then you can see the exterior enclosure, which is the building envelope, goes up quite a bit. This is sort of $2.5 million to $3.8 million. The interior partitions remain the same, finishes remain the same. All of these items are pretty consistent. Mechanical, I think it was actually the mechanical system here was not the significant savings, because they were looking at a little bit different, so they were not quite the 35% savings that Chris was looking at. Site works costs are the same, and then we start to see down here, I think it's going somewhere, we start to see down here, it's an 8% cost premium for this option. So we're kind of hoping that as things progress in the next 5 to 10 years, that heads towards the sort of 2 to 3%. That's it. Thank you very much.
And so now we'll enter the portion of the session. We'll have some dialogue as a panel. And I can think of any questions you want to ask. We'll have about 8 minutes of panel dialogue, followed by about 8 minutes of questions from the audience. So if you have questions, if you can start thinking about them, and then come up to the mic in a few minutes. So maybe I'll start. One of the challenges that we as a city have is considering capital cost, which everyone in the room is very familiar with, and also operating cost, and then looking at the total cost of the building. And Bill, you had a really good slide looking at the operating cost versus the capital cost. And I'm interested to know how BC Housing is able to sort of bridge between the two. We as a city struggle to bridge between capital cost and operating cost. And if you can address how BC Housing does that, that'd be great. Sure.
And given that we're spending public funds on buildings and we're providing housing for low-income tenants, it's super important for us. And I think I don't think there's really the structure on the provincial level or at BC Housing that recognizes the well enough captures the operating costs versus the capital costs, and that's something we need to advance on. But because we have policies like a GHG reduction target of 80%, and we have our sustainability pillar, I can go to our CFO, and I mean there's a lot of silos in large organizations as well, where the people that are building the building are not seeing the savings from the operating. So that's been a really big part of my role, is try to draw the attention to our finance department that, we may save some on capital costs, but in the end, is our operations department going to save that? So going higher up in the organization and letting our CFO know that, and our CEO know that those two things are related, and we're going to pay for them in the long run. We're we build buildings that are very resilient from a carbon and from a utility cost perspective. We're taking lower risks in the long run. So we're putting low-income tenants in these buildings. We want to be sure that their utilities are going to stay low over the long term, and we're not just going to save a lot of money on capital costs up front. So a lot of work to do still, but that's how we address it.
And perhaps, Thomas, you're quite familiar with capital cost versus operating cost, and certainly on a number of LEED projects, and even more so now with the zero carbon standard. Have you heard from any of the large companies and firms and clients that you work with how they work to bridge that barrier between capital cost and operating cost?
That's a good question. Well, I think when I looked at those numbers for the Passive House, and I was going back in my memory 20 years ago when we brought LEED into Canada, it was the same discussion. And I think that, uptake and better understand, and I actually remember, cost consultants were hugely important to us. I still remember there was one of the big cost consultant firms out of Australia, I forget the name now, but they actually picked all the LEED projects on that. They took different building types, I think libraries, schools, and there was a third one, and they picked conventional projects and they put LEED projects on there by certification level. And make a long story short, it was a totally distributed, the LEED projects were equally distributed to the curve, which meant it depends what kind of building you want and how much you want to pay for that building. You want to build a $200 a square foot library, you want to build a $350 square foot library. So I think in between it, the cost is obviously hugely important, but I'm very confident as we move forward, and we have to move forward, that these costs will come down. What we see more in the industry now, we deal a lot with the large commercial real estate owners here in Canada who have in a really massive way bought into green building. And they actually do look at these projects now and that's commercial real estate. These are pension fund money. And pension funds, just want to emphasize, the pension funds is very, very conservative money, because that's money that you need to create pensions for teachers, the municipal workers, and so on. They're looking at green buildings now, investing in buildings for a 10-year return on investment. It's not for them so much about capital and operating. Obviously, operating costs are really important because that saves them money. but it's the bigger return on the investments from those buildings. I know that for build, it's a little bit different being in the public sector and working on affordable housing projects, but you're looking in more from a total cost of ownership as an asset that they invest in, and seeing the change that you will not see any new office buildings in Canada being built at least to the gold or platinum, that they are seeing really good returns from these buildings that are in the range from 6 to 8, sometimes over 10%. That is built into the financial model. That gives me a lot of confidence that if the private sector can do this at this level, that everybody in Canada, any owner can actually do that and benefit from green buildings, and that the business model is actually operating capital costs. We're going to be struggling that forever. So I think total cost of ownership, I think, is the best model to go forward on.
Great. Thank you, Thomas. One piece that was discussed throughout the presentations was preparation for QS firms and preparing for these sort of next generation of buildings, these zero carbon buildings, these passive house buildings. And it'd be great to hear from the panel what either their firm is doing in the case of BC Housing, or what firms can do to prepare for zero carbon or passive house. And perhaps we'll go from Thomas over. Specifically in terms of the zero carbon standard, is there education that's available?
Yeah, the zero carbon standard, I think that, we all together, we're all moving in the same direction. I think it's just in different ways. There is education available now that the standard will actually be open in September for registration for projects, in addition to the pilot projects that are already underway, which gives a lot of confidence that there are 16 owners across the spectrum think they can do this and want to do this moving forward. I think obviously training is hugely important with zero carbon buildings. It is obviously, I would say, I'm very confident that the technology already exists, the know-how already exists. Is from an engineering and an architectural point of view, how do you put those buildings together? The balance that you're going to have to achieve. Because the one thing that we currently just want to pay attention to is there's really this really strong focus now on carbon and on energy. But buildings are for people to either live in there or work in there and learn in there. So I think the buildings need to be two things, need to be very well balanced with health considerations, so ventilation rates, access to daylight, those types of things. Needs to be a really good balance there. And I think we also need to continue to look at building being holistic, meaning you need to look at the waste and energy and water and materials and recycling, all these types of things, because the impact on the buildings is huge, is significant. It's one of the largest industries in the world, has a significant impact. So I think it's really important that in your training and when you look at buildings, I said obviously carbon is a preoccupation now for all of us, but I think it's really important to also pay attention on the other parts and understand the other parts so we get really good buildings that really serve not only the planet, but also the people really well.
And I think one of the big challenges for us with quantity survey information or with costing data that we're getting is that sometimes a design team will be trying to, again, reduce upfront capital costs, but at the same time, a lot of costs for things like drywall and rebar and things are going up. And the project design team will come back to us and say, well, we can't do that near net zero project because it's 15% more expensive. But when we get our own third-party quantity surveyor to analyze this information, we're getting costs really, they're able to tease out those numbers. And I think that's been a great experience for us, is those quantity surveyors that understand passive house and near net zero or zero carbon buildings are much better equipped to take exaggerated figures that are maybe related to other costs and really tease out what is the cost of the additional measures required to get to near net zero or to get to net zero. And when we have quantity surveyors that are educated in that area, we can really see them tease out those individual details, and we're able to see the true cost of going to those levels. And then I can, in my own field in energy management, I can show utility savings and compare those numbers and have a much easier time selling the reduced risks and the reduced costs in the long term of those buildings.
Yeah, we're looking at a few studies right now. It's kind of interesting because we're finding clients like the Vancouver School Board and City of Vancouver for daycares and some of the other school districts are starting to look at passive house as an option. And as you've seen in the slide there, it's a bit of a challenge because it is public funds to try and persuade the Treasury Board to actually fund a project that's 8% higher than a standard project. But one thing that most of the clients are getting rather clever on is they're not just showing the capital expenditure here, they're actually showing what the whole life cost is. Because the operations cost for some of these buildings, because the building services are significantly cheaper, is over the 40 or 50 year life cycle cost is actually cheaper for some of these passive house buildings than a standard conventional construction. So if you're not looking at today's tax dollars and you're looking at it long term, then it's probably something that you should be looking at as opposed to just looking at the straight dollars up front.
We're just about done with the panel section. I'll go through one more question, but if you have a question you'd like to ask the panel, this is sort of a unique opportunity. There is a mic here at the center of the room, close to the front, and if you'd make your way up, that'd be appreciated. Thomas, certainly you're active in Canada, but you're also quite active in a number of boards with international influence. Perhaps you and the other panel members can elaborate on what we can learn about buildings and the cost of building high-performance buildings from other countries internationally. As a city, certainly the city of Vancouver looks to peer cities in the US, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, to see what they're doing when they're pushing either net zero carbon or passive house. Are there activities that we should be aware of in other countries in terms of near net zero buildings or zero carbon buildings?
I think that, as I said in my presentation, is that we see many countries pushing in that direction now around low energy, low carbon, zero carbon. There's a whole bunch of technology, terminology there that essentially covers the same kind of area. I think Canada is very well positioned. I think you probably see the most, from my perspective, I think the most ambitious targets you see in Europe. And one of the reasons simply is that Europe is, has energy scarcity as compared to North America, where we have plenty of energy. It's quite different for Canada when you have your own energy resources, or Germany when you get your natural gas from Russia. So it kind of puts a different, dependencies on what you're trying to achieve. And obviously in this case, in terms of Germany, they really always want to reduce the dependency and they want to get out of nuclear power. So I guess what I'm trying to say is in Canada, what we're going to have to contend with is that we have plenty of energy at a very low cost. But we need to look at these buildings over kind of the life cycle. And I think that these buildings are still going to be around 50, 75, and 100 years. And I think we're seeing that kind of level of discussion internationally now, both in Latin America, which are really the emerging economies that really have an opportunity to leapfrog us. And then also in Asia, where there's significant, particularly in China, significant population growth. But all of these countries have green building councils that really push that forward. So I would say really that when it comes to net zero or zero carbon, that we really align globally into going in a direction that energy efficiency remains a very core concept, and that every country, or I would say maybe every continent, has a kind of a different way of actually going about doing it. So kind of when we think about scale, because I think how do we get this to scale, which is really important, and how can we accelerate that? Because between now and 2030, if you look at the climate change curves, I don't want to get off topic, but if you look at the carbon emission scales, pick any country in the world other than maybe some European countries that are really starting to point it down, they're pointing up, and the gap to where we are, or where we're going, where we need to go, is huge. So we need to take very decisive action in any way possible to get us to these goals by 2030. And then the higher goal by 2050, obviously. But 2030 is only 14 years away, 13 years away, 14 years away. We need very decisive action, and that requires both government in terms of policy, and also requires industry, and all the players in industry like yourself. You have a hugely important role. When you look at the costing that you do, 8% more, 10% more, You have a huge role to keep us honest in terms of moving forward, but that should not prevent us from moving forward. So I think that's the message I want to leave with you today.
Thanks. I think one of the things we've really been influenced by is the European governments, Germany, with regards to the Passive House International standard, and we're trying to find a way on the energy side, at least, to find those where we can spend the least money to get the most reductions, and that's really been an inspiration for us. Is the systems in Europe. And then also a lot of the technology that we need to reach these low carbon or low energy targets are already in use in other parts of the world. For example, heat pump hot water systems are common in Australia and Japan. We don't have an industry for those here yet, but again, as Thomas mentioned, we have a major opportunity. We have very low carbon electricity, so we can bring some of those systems into Canada. That's been the major influence for our projects, is to see some of these technologies that are already well proven and cost effective in other countries, and to be able to pilot those here and hopefully start fledgling industries for it. And certainly our lead projects and our CAGBC partnership has helped us to pilot a lot of those technologies on our buildings.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, again, I keep coming back to that 8% variance, but talking about Europe, Germany and Ireland have got between a 1% and 3% premium for passive house. And as good QSs know, it's pretty easy to do some cost cutting when you've got a 1% to 3% variance. So if the European countries can do it through their design process, I'm pretty sure it'll be easily transferable to North America.
And maybe we'll close out with some thoughts on reducing risk. We've certainly heard, and we're all aware of the risk of climate change and the huge challenge that presents. One of the really strong pieces of a successful QS is helping the project reduce its risk. And in looking at passive house or net zero or zero carbon, there's the perceived and potential increased risk because there's a higher cost. And as a QS, there's an opportunity to help reduce that risk and help the project move forward, which ultimately addresses the climate risk. So I'd like to thank our esteemed panel members for their participation this morning, and thank you for having us here, and I hope you have a very inspiring rest of your day. And with that, I'll turn it over to Matt.